Thanks a lot for coming back in. I appreciate the interest. Let me start by giving you a little bit of background. I'm an Austrian. I talk about Austrian economics, but in a very peculiar way. Now, I started out as a nuclear physicist, who then studied economics and sociology in Vienna. I have to admit it was for relatively sexist reasons. There were more girls in economics and sociology than in physics. But what afterwards turned out to be surprising is that there was no Austrian economics left in Austria. That tradition had completely disappeared. And I only discovered it in the US when I worked there as a natural scientist, because in the US somehow a certain foundational myth had become linked to a strong narrative, and interestingly it was in particular three women that were really great in expressing these ideas in fictional form, not in the scientific form. And those ladies were Ayn Rand, Rose Weiler Lane and Isabel Patterson, who somehow linked the foundational myth of the US as the home of the free and the brave with the concept of liberty. And it was an economist of the Austrian school, Mary Rothbard, who learned from Ludwig von Mises, was mentioned before in New York, who then he started out as a lefty like Ben, and who got increasingly disgruntled with the US left, in particular those that will refer to themselves as liberals. What he disliked about the liberals is that they had become the establishment, and from his point of view corrupted by the military-industrial machinery in or complex, how they called it in the US. He was very anti-interventionist, usually critical about how this foundational myth of the land of the free and the brave had turned into just another imperial structure. But he was disgruntled with the mainstream left and the liberals. That's why he coined the term libertarian, and that at the time when I was in the US in the late 90s had become a niche movement of libertarians, within which the Austrian school was revered as the kind of scientific underpinning of the concept of liberty. It was also a new home that Austrian economists like Ludwig von Mises adopted as their new home. It was a really difficult process for them. Mises was already quite old. He had to leave his whole heritage behind, the whole continent of Europe, where his whole identity was linked to. He had to leave all that behind in the totalitarianism of that terrible century, how Rothbard would call it, and he started anew. And he adopted this narrative, this idea that there could be a place for liberty. And it changed a bit his approach to Austrian economics, how he presented it, and the role it adopted while there. So we have to be thankful for this US tradition. Without it, probably it wouldn't have survived as a chain of thought. I was lucky to then learn from the last representatives of that tradition, and paradoxically, it turned out to be Germans. Rothbard's most important student, Hans Hermann Hoppe, a German professor who took over his teaching position in Las Vegas, out of all places, and the other person I could learn from was Roland Bader, who is not known in the US, but was the only one in Europe who was a student of Hayek and still conveyed this idea of the Austrian school as something particular that had value, that wouldn't have become part of mainstream economics or been relegated to history books. So he was the only person at the time when I was reading about Austrian economics who was writing books in German on Austrian economics and trying to pass on the tradition. I tried to take over that tradition, but then I realized what I had learned in Vienna when growing up. I was also a very curious person. There were no Austrian economists, but there were a few remaining professors of the old Viennese tradition of the sciences, in particular psychology, ethnology, evolutionary theory, epistemology, Vienna used to be center of those sciences, and then only later I realized how the things connected and how the original Austrian school came about to be. And it's a bit of a different story. Now, I'm one of the few these days who came to Austrian economics before coming to Bitcoin. These days, mostly when people discover Austrian economics is through Bitcoin, because they learn about Bitcoin as this great revolutionary idea, and then maybe they hear about it. It's probably based or inspired on Austrian economics, and it seems that like that has to be this even more foundational, revolutionary idea. Interestingly and paradoxically, my stance is a bit different. I think ideas are overrated generally, but there's a reason for that. So Austrian economics originally started out as a kind of anti-idea. It's a similar thing with Bitcoin, I'd say. Bitcoin, for most people, is an idea who are like fall in love with it as an idea. For a few people, it's a tool. And a similar thing, I think, was at the emergence of the Austrian school. It emerged more as a tool to understand reality. And it was in contrast to idealism, which was the philosophy in fashion in Germany. And idealism comes from a very old idea that goes back to Plato, but has been around for longer, that we realize that, of course, ideas are of huge importance. They have a huge impact in the world, and that can lead to some people to assume that the actual reality is ideas. Those are the actual things that we need to care about. And then we can start inflating those ideas a bit and linking our identity to these ideas. Most people assume to this day the tools are more dangerous than ideas, because we can see how a dangerous person that carries a tool becomes even more dangerous. I'd say ideas are much more dangerous than tools, because if you carry an idea, you can be the most innocent person, but you can be the carrier of something that's like a disease. And ideas, in contrast to tools, are not limited by reality. That's the thing that's attractive about ideas. That's why adoption of ideas is easier. That's why usually if lots of people are reached by something, it's rather in the shape of ideas. But because ideas are not limited by reality, which is the nice thing, and it feels nice about it, it's like you can be creative, you can have fantasy, they can be very dangerous, because you don't need to understand it, and you don't need to check it with reality. And the original Austrian school was a kind of counter-reaction to that rule of ideas that had run amok and had broken loose from reality. So the original insight of the Austrian school is realism. Is you got to go back to reality, what's actually happening. That doesn't mean that you ignore ideas. It's you understand the importance of ideas. You take a huge interest in discussing those ideas, but you are looking for tools to help you cope with it and to understand those ideas. And you try to do it in a non-judgmental way. That was the original approach of the Austrian school, to be value neutral. Like first understand and then judge, not judge first, because judgment usually is linked to ideas of identity, to ideas of belonging, to ideas of us against them. Now you may all know the meme of the word cell with the shapeshifter. Now BTC++ is more of a shape rotator conference. That's probably why it has less people in the audience. Ideas have more appeal, words have more appeal, because it's easier to carry them, and it seemed to leave more room for you to fit anything within those ideas. Tools are limited and limiting, and the usefulness is in their limitations, usually, that they interact with reality. So the Austrian schools tried to understand complex phenomena within a more or less broken society and grasp first what's real, what's actually going on, what do real people do and why do they do it, and then they realized, okay, the why is really tricky because the why is in the mental sphere. There's psychology, that's something else, because psychology, because it's in the realm of the imaginary and the mental, cannot be a deductive science that has laws, that is reproducible, but it's a kind of history of our moods, of our thought patterns, of our dreams, but we cannot deduce something with the rigor of the scientist that has been so appealing as a figure of authority, the white-collared scientist who comes about with the laws. And that has been, of course, abused by most disciplines like psychology, but even more so economics, to try to come up with that kind of authority of claiming true and false and being the expert. The Austrian school is a very humble approach to what we can know. And it starts from that appreciation of reality, how complex it is, and it starts with the simplest phenomena, and it starts with the limitations in reality. It starts with a grasp that we as human beings, when we act, we have to choose, and we have to choose because we are real beings within real space-time. I cannot at the same time be here and now at my home in Switzerland. I had to take a choice. It was a difficult choice. It's a preference ranking, and it's a choice under uncertainty. I didn't know how it would turn out to be here. I don't know what's the opportunity cost, another concept of economics. I didn't know about the trade-offs. I had to act under these conditions, and that was a real thing. And that's the interest of the Austrian school, what really happened, not what I talk about and say I'd really like to. It's what did you do? Because by actually doing something, I have to allocate myself and scarce resources among conflicting ends, and that's a limitation that is reality. And only these kind of limitations lead to something more useful. Then it's not just the idea realm of what I could have and should have, and so on. It's what did I actually do? How did I actually rank things? And it goes to this approach of preferences. Now, Austrian school talks about preferences. The next limitation that we realize when we have to figure out our preferences is there are other people with preferences. And there is something called exchange, where we can figure out that other people may have means to our ends and we may have means to their ends. And for most of the history of economic thought, almost all people got it wrong. They thought it's like people exchange things of similar or same value. It's because we agree, oh, that's the price of it, of course, oh, that's the fair price, and then we exchange. No, in reality, that can only happen if we have an inverse order of preferences. If I value more what you have than I have, and it must be the opposite for you. And it seems very unlikely and unusual to happen until we discover something else. Next to that kind of realism, the Austrian school discovered marginalism, that action only happens at the margin, and at the margin is I never act on the basis of an idea of everything. I can claim that, of course, water is much more important than diamonds, and everyone would agree. But at the margin, the additional class of water here in Vienna is, for me, of very little marginal value because I know it's an endless supply for my needs. So it's like the millionth, billionth class of water that I compare. And that makes the exchange possible because I could care about apples much more than you. And I could specialize in the production of apples. And even though I care more about apples, as I'm specialized in producing apples, if I exchange with you, I exchange my millionth apple. And for you, it'll be the first one, the second apple And so through this marginal utility of the apple, we can find an exchange that's a win-win situation and that links even foreigners because we can understand this means-end relation. Now the ends, where those ends come about, that's more or less in the mental sphere. The tradition that was closest in understanding some of the patterns behind this is the evolutionary sciences that also developed at the same time in Austria or in Vienna. And Hayek even had a background there, and his whole family had a deep interest in that biological side. That's already quite some uncertainty and complexity. But if we add into the picture the question of the means, what is actually useful for our ends, we enter another field, another discipline, and the Austrian school called that technology. And they appreciated technology as a field with its own complexity outside the realm of simplistic economics. It's another kind of logical structure. It's a discovery process of tools for subjective ends that we need to figure out. And so it has become, I'd say, the economic tradition that most cares about tools because it sees tools, means for the ends of lots of people as the crucial invisible part of wealth, mainly capital. That's what they call capital. It's not the capital in capitalism. That started out as many terms as a kind of labeling of the crazy enemy of the distorted structure. Capital for the Austrian school really is tools. It's kind of tools that are subjectively seen by people as being useful to their ends. And only very few people really care about the tools. That was another main insight. The value comes from reaching your goals and ends. That's why like this shape rotator interest in the tools will always be a niche thing, and the mass adoption thing of the tools is always like an idea, understanding how it fulfills needs and ends of people. So gradually, by going that step-by-step process rooted in reality, we can understand quite complex concepts, the limitations of our human action, the limitations and possibilities of exchange of trade, and how these relationships form ever complex structures, which the Austrian school called catalexy, or the catalectic order, from that kind of exchange that makes human relations or relations between foreigners possible and fruitful and productive. It leads to an understanding of the capital structure that Max has talked about in the morning, I think to some extent. And it leads to an appreciation of uncertainty in figuring out that even, of course, the ends are not set. It's our preferences, and we have to reconsider them again and again as we learn about the real world and as we learn about the preferences of other people. We adopt. So there's inherent uncertainty about these preferences, these rankings, and there is inherent uncertainty about the means, because that's technology. Technology is always figuring out things, and most things don't work. It's a lot of trial and error. That's how technological progress works. Adds a lot of uncertainty, and combining these two forms of uncertainty leads to an appreciation of uncertainty, which leads paradoxically the Austrian school to be the only economics tradition that really values the entrepreneur and entrepreneurship. Not as an abstract idea, not because the entrepreneur is a kind of hero and everyone should be like that. No, it's from the appreciation of uncertainty that we know it's a burden. It's a burden for most people to carry that uncertainty, and it's part of a division of labor that some people can realize they are more willing and able to carry that burden of uncertainty, which is inevitable. And of course, this uncertainty is linked to a kind of epistemological humility, that even the expert, or in particular the expert, doesn't know everything. Austrian economics is the only economics tradition that's very critical of economics. Hayek is the only recipient of the fake Nobel Prize that in his acceptance speech criticized this prize for being a really stupid idea because it gives legitimacy to considering economics as a kind of science that would honor expertise. We know very well, if we look at the empirics of economics, is that the worst people to ask about economics are economists. Because we know empirically their predictions are worse than rolling the dice. So you're better off with rolling the dice than asking an economist. And the more famous the economist, the worse is their predictive power, because of course their main function is something else, and it's more related to the ideas than to the tools kind of things, because tools are limiting against, and ideas are not, and thus ideas are much more useful for interests and hidden interests than these tools. This appreciation of uncertainty leads to an appreciation of entrepreneurship, but it also leads to another appreciation and a deep interest in another phenomenon, in another kind of tool. In order to cope with uncertainty, people have discovered a certain protocol kind of technology, and that is the thing that we unaptly denominate with the term money. Now, most people who think about money, and also most Bitcoiners, are more shaped by ideas. And if we are too idealist about these concepts, we mistake words with the things they stand for, and we are led to the illusion that money is a thing, that it's actually something. And then we have this typical binary discussion of the Bitcoiner who claims like Bitcoin is the perfect kind of money, it's sound money, it's the best money, and we have the usual economist, even Austrian economists, who would say no, Bitcoin is no money at all. It's like, it seems like totally binary, stupid opposition. One must be stupid. But of course, the resolution of it is money is not a thing. Money is an attribute, maybe. It's something we discover about the world. It's about a real use case, and that's due to uncertainty. The higher the perceived uncertainty, the more useful will be a kind of very indirect exchange mechanism, which has two aspects. And I think Hubertus has referred to these two aspects. I would refer to them in a bit different way, in the kind of exchange in space and exchange in time, which is an issue for us. It's not easy. And what people are looking for is more marketable goods. Goods are the essence of exchange. We figure out you have something I need, but in order to find you and reach you, it must be a fit in space and time. And that's not that easy. And that's the two aspects of money, exactly, figuring out that fit in time and space. And the more uncertain, the more I need to be able to cope with that variations in space and time. Now, the less I know about a space and the less I know how much money I need, the more I need to carry in my wallet, if we still carry around wallets. So usually when we were tourists, back in the days when people were using paper money, now they're using the Apple Wallet, you would carry a lot of cash if you were abroad in a foreign country, because uncertainty was high. You didn't know exactly what you will need, what the prices will be, and so on. And that's the reason why higher perceived uncertainty leads to a demand of money per se, and not the goods directly, because I don't know yet what kind of goods I need. Who are the market partners that will have those goods, and at what time will that be available? So that's why I demand something else without understanding it, without seeing that it's a thing. I only see the surface area, the UX of that kind of protocol, which can be very different for different people and different use cases. I think it was in particular Hayek who figured that thing out. That's pay attention. Money is not a thing. It's just a word to describe something that we have to learn, that we discover. And of course, what we discovered, and for me it was quite a wonder to discover, I've been there from the earliest beginning, in seeing that mutual discovery of moneyness in Bitcoin. How something that every economist who had a clue about anything would say that that's so unlikely, like the emergence of that thing. And it was hidden in plain sight because the odd thing is its creator told you it's meant to be money, but that of course was a sign to any economist to compare like reality and what's claimed as an idea and just say, okay, that's a mismatch, like it's not true, obviously not true. And the wondrous thing about Bitcoin is that gradually, against all odds, people discovered some moneyness in it. And it's totally wrong to think that like money is the end result. We look at the end result and we say, okay, Bitcoin is no universal medium of exchange, of course. But the interesting thing is the process, is the dynamic, is the marginal discovery of more use cases by more people and the marginal increased usefulness for some problems that probably we in the privileged West haven't yet seen to the full extent. That's why most adoption of Bitcoin, of course, in the West comes from the kind of speculation purpose is just having savings and keeping them for the long term. And then we're looking for exotic assets. So buy something that everyone else is buying before everyone else is buying it. That's this kind of rat race we are in. And that's where Bitcoin has gradually been adopted in a niche field, but a surprising story, of course, a wondrous story, but where the original Austrian school would look in a much more humble and realist way, and realizing that most people don't care about the tool, only when it fixes a problem they actually have. That's why a lot of the real Bitcoin adoption comes from very problematic countries where there are a lot of problems and issues, and I'd expect more of that real adoption, the real features of Bitcoin to come out of that part of the world and not out of places like that, like Vienna in Austria or Switzerland. Even though I'd say, of course, part of that discovery is the time aspect of it, of people realizing that if I save for old age, it's a fairy tale that you put coins into a piggy bank. That's just something we tell our children, like a Santa Claus and so on. That's not grounded in reality. It has no causal relation, putting coins in a piggy bank, to your purchasing power in 20, 30, 40 years. Has no actual relevant correlation to that outcome, and that's of course what people realize, and when they feel it as a pain because they don't have access to the particular kind of savings goods that are wrongly used, like real estate in Austria, the main category of how the middle class or upper middle class somehow tries to preserve the purchasing power, then of course there's a little niche and shining use case for Bitcoin here, and I would still appreciate it that way. So, to cut the story short, the Austrian School of Economics tried to go from first principles. One first principle is realism, marginalism, subjectivism, individualism. I haven't talked about subjectivism and individualism, so just a brief referral. Most people get it entirely wrong. They think subjectivism, and in philosophy it's called like that, means the things I like should be true, and everything is subjective, and so I shape the world according to my ideas. That's subjectivism. That's subjectivism based in this kind of idealism. Like I want the things to be like they should be. There's this normative, judgmental, identitarian approach to things. The Austrian school said, no, actual reality tells you that we are beings in our perception. We have to subjectively understand things. That doesn't mean that we are necessarily shaping things by that perception. Of course, ideas can have a strong impact. They can move us to do things, and it makes them that dangerous, but also impactful. It's just an appreciation that every kind of understanding and learning has to go through the subject and through the understanding of the subject. And that, of course, is a very useful approach in all practical parts of economics. Understanding where value comes from, the original insights of Karl Menger, you have this kind of empathy. So even if you don't understand people, you have to understand people in order to sell something, to produce something of value. You really have this empathy because the subject has to understand it, has to see, oh, that's actually my goal. Yes, you're right. Oh, that's a means for me. That's a tool for me. That you have to get right, and that's the essence of subjectivism. What's the essence of individualism? It's not, oh, I like to be on my own, and that's how the world should be. No, individualism means that we know the actual constituent of any complex structure is an acting individual, but that, of course, can understand, doesn't have to, but can understand that even his self-interest is furthered by cooperation or not hindered by cooperation. That's why the original Austrian school wasn't atomistic, individualistic in the senses. They really appreciated cooperation. They really appreciated a societal order. They appreciated the protocols of cooperation. One of such, money, being money. So it's not a kind of lone wolf ideology, which has its value as an idea and as a narrative. And I like, of course, the idea of the sovereign individual. But it's, if you're grounded in reality, you see, no, it's like all these complex structures wouldn't have a life on their own if the constituents wouldn't be able to function within that structures, to understand that those structures would be in their interest. But of course, from the subjective appreciation, it's not only material needs, it can be identity needs, it can be needs linked to narratives, and there we are in the field of ideas again. And one of the crucial insights of those colleagues of the Austrian school around the Austrian school came into the circles of the Austrian school and were interested in the why do people act the way they acted. They came up with the concept of theology or political theology. They understood that an even better approach to understand those kind of ideas, fear, is to go at the root needs of people and to understand that the strongest narratives, of course, and the strongest links to our needs were parts of religion. And they understood that a lot of the politics we talk about these days, and where most of the interest comes from, also in Austrian economics, of course, are closely linked to our sense of belonging and sense of meaning. And it's this appreciation to understand that part of the subjective way to cope with uncertainty in our world is the longing for meaning and the longing for belonging, actually. And so it's even this individualist, subjectivist approach leads you to an appreciation of ideas, but you don't come to the foolish conclusion that a lot of modernity has, like we have, bypassed religion. Now we are so enlightened. Now we only have scientific ideas, but you figure out actually it's replacement religions. All this talk about like capitalism versus anti-capitalism is identity things that are at the basis, even like Marxism, where the Austrian schools took a strong interest in, was the first group of scientific economists that actually discussed Marxism at university, when most other economists thought, oh no, that's crazy nonsense. And they realized actually it has a kind of substitute religious underpinning that's much more important, and it doesn't make it less important in the thing. It makes it even more interesting to see all the patterns of how like Christian beliefs have been kind of turned on their head, and how it has been going through the history of ideas. And that led quite a few students of the Austrian school to a deep interest in the history of ideas, a deep interest in theology. And one of those was Rothbard, who really wrote, I think one of his best works is not in economics, it's actually the history of ideas, where he looked at the whole like history of Western civilization, more or less, and other civilizations as well, and looked at the patterns emerging and came to very interesting ideas that are now seeping back into discussion a little bit about how apocalyptic ideas play a very important role, how this end of times thinking that was related to millenarism and so on. Very odd ideas for an economist to discuss, but sometimes crucial insights to understand that there are some very deep things in human beings that can play a very important role, and that also explain why usually ideas are much more dangerous than tools, contrary to the approach. And that's why I also think if you have a deep interest in Bitcoin, it's the safer and better way to perceive it as a tool and understand it as a tool and not as a fixed idea that solves everything at once, because it's a gradual process. It can still fail, as everything that human beings try out can fail, and where the role, and also the role as Max has given some credence to of the cypherpunks, of those originally trying out things, is very much in the core tradition of the Austrian school. Now, I say it frequently, Karl Menger, the founder, he had two favorite students, and they were his favorite students, so he recommended to them something much more realistic. He recommended to them, don't go into academics. Don't become professors of economics. That's not a good idea. There's something much more interesting than doing that, and it's figuring out how that approach to reality can actually be applied in the real world. And his two favorite students, one founded or helped re-establish the tradition of private banking in Switzerland, which has played a crucially important role after the World Wars and during the World Wars in preserving some of the capital or liquid form of capital that would then help us rebuild the capital structure after the wars. And his other favorite student entered the only useful part of politics, that's diplomacy, that's figuring out behind the scenes how interests could match even between enemies. And of course, Bitcoin is very much in that tradition. That's why I consider Satoshi Nakamoto as one of the true disciples of the Austrian school. I think the Austrian school has been underrated in its practical importance. I think it had a huge impact on the world, but through the lesser known people that haven't ended up as professors at universities or written many books, but were entrepreneurs, were cypherpunks, were people trying out new tools and figuring out new ways that were grounded in reality. And that's why I think it's true, in a sense, that Bitcoin is based and inspired by the Austrian school, not so much its idea, but more this realistic approach to human nature. Thank you for your attention. I'm looking forward to discussion now.